Peace and love. My name is Robin Hotep, broadcasting on behalf of 13scienceastrology.com. I'm doing this video, which is kind of like, you could say, part 3 to a series that I'm on in relationship to vampires. But and it's kind of like linked into the quarantine. But in this video, I'm going to kind of like take it to another level to help you to kind of understand why the quarantine was even put in place in the first place, and to help you to understand the different sides of this war that is going on, that is still going on between the Annunaki and what you would call the ancient ones. When I say the ancient ones, are really those that were on this planet before humans got here. Now, to really understand, I'll start off with the vampires to help you go ahead and walk you all the way out of that. To really understand the root of how vampires operate, it's going to basically take you into the dragon scenario, in the situation dealing with dragons. Now, a lot of people have heard about dragons. They think they're mythological creatures that don't exist and things of that nature. Dragons exist, but they exist on the 4th dimension. At one time, this planet vibrated on the 4th dimension. It was a 4th dimensional planet at one time. And when the quarantine was put into place, this planet basically became a 3rd dimensional planet. The quarantine was what made this planet a 3rd dimensional planet. And the reason why the quarantine was put into place was, as I've already said, was to keep beings out of this dimension or this realm, because the Annunaki had an experiment going on in this realm. Now, this links back to vampires because vampires made a pact with dragons. And furthermore, in the vampire doctrine, when you study it, the vampires believe that the dragons still exist on this planet within the center of the earth. And they tap into the dragon force. And that's what gives vampires their power to do a lot of the things that, I've already talked about that they do, such as being able to fly and things of this nature. But the thing is, vampires can fly, but it takes place on a 4th dimension. See, to really understand a vampire is on 3rd dimension, 4th dimension, and even 5th dimension. So to really understand how vampires operate, you have to be able to understand the 3rd, 4th, and 5th dimensions. So they got their power to control here on the 3rd dimension from the dragons. And the dragons had a war with the Annunaki. And of course they lost. And this war is documented in the Sumerian tablets when you read about Kingu. Kingu was the leader of the dragons, a female, and she was defeated by the Annunaki. And basically what happened was that she was cast into, when she was defeated, she was cast into the earth, into the center of the earth, or into what they call the underworld. The underworld is basically, in this sense, because the underworld has different meanings, but in this sense, the underworld was the center of the earth. Now, you might be wondering, why is all of this important when it comes to dealing with the quarantine? What does this have to do with the quarantine? It has a lot to do with the quarantine, because they had to defeat, when I say they, the Annunaki had to successfully defeat Kingu so that they could go ahead and shape humanity as we are today. So we have, dragons are basically a form of reptilians. We have reptilian in us, and the dragon force was put inside of us. But what the Annunaki did was they put what they call the spell of Kingu on us. The spell of Kingu, or the spell of sleep. And what the spell of Kingu is that pretty much the spell of Kingu, it blocks the Kundalini energy from being able to rise, and basically it took us out of communication with our higher senses of telepathy, clairvoyance, and intuition. And the Anunnaki did this because they had an experiment going, and this put us into the third dimension. See, when they fused us together or whatever, they had to basically put a cap on this Kundalini energy so that the Kundalini or the dragon spirit wouldn't be able to awaken and arise in us. So what these vampires learned how to do, these were a group of kind of like renegades that learned, they knew about the quarantine, you know, and they basically made a pact with the dragons, and the Dragon Society taught them how to get their Kundalini energy back. And they take that energy, and this is how they became vampires. But they did it, and they took an oath to where it was like this. You get your Kundalini energy back, so you'll have your higher senses, but you can't wake up and tell other people that aren't initiates because of the quarantine. So this is why the vampires and the immortal societies that are basically different classes of vampires, this is how they got their power, and this is how they stayed in power for so long, was because they made a pact with the dragon societies that exist in the center of the earth that were defeated by Murdoch. Murdoch was a warrior of the Annunaki. He defeated Kingu and cast her into the center of the earth. And vampires swear their allegiance, most of them, to Kingu, who is located in the center of the earth. And this is where they get their energy from. And they taught them about the Kundalini Force. So when you start thinking about dragons, like on one level, yeah, they're dragons on the fourth dimension. But then on the third dimension, it becomes an energy force. It's like you're working with this energy force. So on the fourth dimension, they're very much dragons. But on the third dimension, it represents the Kundalini Force. The Kundalini Force. And the Anunnaki didn't want you to know about the Kundalini Force. So this is where you get in the Bible where it talks about the Garden of Eden and God putting you inside of this enclosed garden called the Garden of Delight or the Garden of Eden. And basically telling you can eat from all these different trees, but you can't eat from that tree, and kind of putting rules and regulations on you. This was the beginning of the spell of what they call Leviathan. Some people call it the spell of Leviathan. Leviathan is the same thing as Kingu, the spell of Kingu, or the spell of sleep. So these vampires, they're connected to that because they, just like the Dragon Society, they disagree with the Anunnaki because they felt like the Anunnaki were basically keeping them away from certain information and certain knowledge. So what they did was they got the power from those that are in the center of the earth and became initiated into the Dragon Society, and this is how they became vampires. This is the other half of the story. It was tied into the Anunnaki, the spell of Kingu, the spell of what they call sleep. And this is what makes your third dimension real. The third dimension is only real because of the senses of the majority of the beings on the center of, the majority of us that are located on the surface of the earth have no access to our higher senses, which are telepathy, clairvoyance, and intuition, and psychometry, meaning that we are essentially slaves to our senses, our five senses, which is seeing, tasting, hearing, touching, and feeling. So we are slaves to those senses, slaves to it. So basically what that means is that we've been cut off from the fourth dimension. The only way to get into the fourth dimension is to have those higher senses activated. So that's what the quarantine is really about. It cut you off. The quarantine was really, basically, it cut you off from communication with the fourth dimension, which created the third dimension. So this is how the matrix, the third dimension is the matrix. So this is how the matrix was created. It was based on being cut off from that dimension. But like I said, the vampires and those that were initiated into the vampire society, that's how they learned about the Kundalini energy. This is where your Hindus, the Hindu doctrine, came from the vampire society. This is why they knew about breath, the chi, raising of the energy, and things of this nature, because they didn't agree with the Anunnaki and what the Anunnaki did. And they were in disagreement. So even though the Anunnaki kind of closed off the majority of the planet, there still were basically what they call immortals, or different societies of immortals that were still very much privy to the knowledge of the higher senses and knew how to tap into the knowledge of the higher senses through the activation of the Kundalini. And basically what they did was they were able to, what you call, break quarantine. So they broke quarantine. And these beings broke quarantine and they began to rule over you. So many of your vampires, some of them, because they weren't able to tell this information publicly, they created religions. And they taught some of their initiates within these religions about this higher information, this higher knowledge. But as far as the whole surface of the planet being privy to this knowledge, that was totally blocked off because of the quarantine that the Anunnaki set up. So it's more like if you didn't come in contact with a mortal or a vampire or, you know, any type of immortal, then you wouldn't know this information. Or you wouldn't know how to contact or to activate these higher senses so that you could contact higher beings and so that you could have these, like, what you call superpowers. So this is where you get your superheroes and all that stuff from. It all comes from this war that took place because the Anunnaki couldn't afford for humans at this time, because humans were like the Anunnaki's asset, keep in mind. Like, we were like their asset. They created us. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people, like, they be dealing with the Anunnaki information and they look at them like they are benevolent and all of that. But the Anunnaki is just like humans. They want to give you limited information and rule over you too. So you even have to surpass them even. You see, so now that the quarantine is lifted, the quarantine would only last, or what they call the spell. See, they called the quarantine in the Sumerian tablets the Spell of Kingu. And the spell or the quarantine would only last for up to 6,000 years, which is over. Which is going to be over really soon. It's ending now. So all of your religions and all of that, this is why, like, in your main Western religions, they don't talk about the Kundalini energy and how to activate it. They don't talk about Qi. But then, like, in your Chinese societies and in your, you know, in the Hindu societies, and in a lot of your Eastern culture and your Hindu culture, they very much know about the Kundalini and things of this nature. Now, ancient Kemet, a lot of people, they like to deal with Kemet, but see, in Kemet, they didn't publicly teach about the Kundalini or the snake. You've seen the deities with the snake coming out of their head, but you didn't know what that meant unless you were initiated into the mystery system. So you had to be an initiate, a part of a certain class to learn about this. Because in Kemet and, you know, in that land, that's where the Anunnaki, that was like really their stomping ground or whatever. And like Kemet and where Iraq is now, I mean, that's where they, you know, that's where they reigned at, parts of Africa. So you had like the group and the tribe that didn't agree with the quarantine. They broke away and they became your Hindus or whatever. They left out of Africa and Kemet and moved into, and this is why the Hindu system and culture is slightly different as far as their deities and the way they look at everything is versus Kemet. They have the same teachings in Kemet and in India, but it's just in Kemet it was taught more of a secret versus in India it was just kind of like more open knowledge until a certain point, and it became a secret there too. But still, even more so, I mean, most of your Hindus know more about the Kundalini forces and the Kundalini energy more than your different humans, you know, that were from Africa and places like that. So this is why religion, as far as like Christianity and all that, more so thrives. Christianity, Islam, and Judaism more so thrives in like Africa and in the Middle East and all of that. But then when you start getting it over into like India and all that, you notice they're more so into like our so-called alternative religions like Hinduism and all that. And I'm not saying Hinduism wasn't watered down. I'm not saying that, because it was watered down to a certain degree, but they still have more knowledge of the occult arts and the tantric sciences and things of that nature was more readily available. That's all it really was. It was more readily available over there. Versus in Africa, it was more like secret. They kept it more of a secret, more in Africa and things like that. So yeah, I mean, that's basically what's going down or whatever with your whole vampire society. Now in Kemet, the vampire society was up under the school of Tahuti. So Tahuti was the master alchemist, the master magician that taught you how to activate the Kundalini Force and initiated you into the school of the vampire. It was through Tahuti. There is a ritual that is done by a certain secret society where you lay in a coffin for a certain amount of days. Well, you don't do it in days here in the secret society, but you lay in a coffin and you confess your secrets and things of this nature in this coffin. This is a ritual that's done by a certain secret society. They got that ritual from Kemet because this was the ritual that one had to go through to become an initiate in the vampire society, or what they would call a Jedi. Actually, that's where they got the Jedi concept from. The Jedis were basically like the vampires. They had the higher powers and they could manipulate the Force, and they knew how to work with the Force. See, that's all the vampire is really doing, is learning how to work with the Force or the Kundalini energy and to manipulate events. And this is where the guy that wrote Star Wars or whatever, I think it's George Lucas. This is where he got that from. The whole thing about the Force and the Jedis and all that. He got that from the vampire information. So this is what your Jedis were. They knew how to tap into the Force. They were basically like vampires. It's still a piece of the vampire story even in Star Wars. Yeah, they didn't call them vampires in Star Wars, but again, they were called Jedis. And they got that from Egypt. Because the Jedis were up under the school of Tahuti in ancient Egypt. He was the master alchemist or whatever. So that's what's going on or whatever when it comes to the whole thing about dragons, vampires, and how they all like correlate with the quarantine or whatever. So like your religions and all that stuff was basically designed, the religions like in Africa, that came out of Africa, like your Christianity, Islam, and Judaism and all that was designed to like keep you disconnected from the Kundalini energy, and only the priest and the high priest knew about it. But they kept this away from the general public or whatever because, like I said, the quarantine was on and there was a ban on using those higher senses. We were banned from that. So it's not that. So when you talk about the quarantine, certain people still kept connection with higher beings, but it was just like basically if you weren't connected with a certain immortal, or if you didn't know a certain secret society that was connected and had the knowledge of how to connect to those higher senses and to those higher powers, then you basically were immortal. That's where they get the term mortal from. A mortal is basically one that doesn't have their higher senses activated. That's what immortal is. So you would be considered immortal if you didn't have a mortal, not immortal, but amortal, if you didn't have those senses activated. So the whole quarantine basically ties into the religions because they suppressed, in the religions they suppressed the higher senses information, and that's why they have you going out and worshiping deities and stuff like that. See, those that are really deep in the energy know that when you worship a god outside of yourself, you have to give them energy, and you're losing chi and you're losing energy. And the more you give out energy, the more you won't be able to activate the Kundalini Force within you. So this is how the vampires were able to rule over people for so long, and to basically rule over societies for so long, because they were immortals. And the vampires were the ones that set up your Illuminati, which you have today. See, they were the ones that taught the Illuminati. It was the vampires and the immortal societies. They taught the vampires. They taught the Illuminati. What they, like, you know what I'm saying, how they like taught them how to rule and manipulate through energy and, you know, keeping people suppressed. Because it was all tied into the quarantine. See, this whole world that we live in is based on a quarantine. And once that's lifted, this is why your Illuminati and these groups are going to lose power, many of them. And that's why a lot of them are already built their civilizations and becoming self-sustaining, because they know that once the quarantine is lifted, people will get back access to their higher senses again. And once they get back access to their higher senses again, they're going to realize that they don't need to look outside of themselves and depend on governments and things like that to thrive. So that's what basically to help you to understand what's going on now as far as with the quarantine, the Illuminati, the dragons, and the vampires, and like why it all happened and how it all ties in together. The last thing I'll make clear is this: we were created, as far as human beings, from the reptilians. We all have reptilian in us. Don't let anybody tell you anything different. So when you start hearing about people like David Icke and different people like that talk about we're not reptilian, like only some people are reptilians and all that, that's not factual 100%. Everybody has reptilian in them. Any human has reptilian in them because the Annunaki used the reptilian gene to create us, but then they suppressed the Kundalini Force. See, that whole Kundalini thing, all that goes back to the dragon societies and the reptilian traits. But what they did in humans was they blocked us off from having access to that. So they mixed up Anunnaki genetics with reptilian genetics and created, and other beings were involved in this too. Like I said, there's 23 different species. And that's what makes your original human or whatever. It came from that. It came from the mixture of those different species, and they had to go to war and push the Dragon Society into the center of the earth so that they wouldn't mess with us, and they dropped us down to the third dimension. So your dragons, they still exist just on the fourth dimension. If you don't have access to that and you can't tap into that dimension, then that's why you think dragons aren't real and vampires aren't real and things like that, because you don't have access to the fourth dimension. So basically that's what's going down or whatever, as far as like now everything is reversing. So now we're going to wake up humans for the first time. And the Anunnaki is going to come back, you know, because they look at it like we're their experiments, but now we have the potential to surpass the Anunnaki, even though they're our parents or our creators, or you could say we could surpass them now. meaning that you can't even let them rule over you. You can't even let an alien rule over you or any type of entity, because we can surpass them now once we activate our Kundalini and tap into our higher senses and things of that nature. So it's all about energy and just working with energy and things of this nature. So I hope this helps to help you understand why the quarantine was set into place, and to help you to understand more about Kundalini, and to help you to understand about how religion plays a part, and to help you to understand about how certain societies, like I said, the Hindu culture didn't agree with the quarantine, so they separated, and this is why they have different information than the information that we have. And that pretty much sums up this video, and until we meet again, I'll leave you in peace.